On the evening of December 27, 1984, a 16-year-old boy named John Bulwer sat in the passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep as they drove down a residential road in St. Paul, Minnesota. John's best friend was driving, and two more of their friends from school were in the back seat. They were all talking and laughing and singing along to the radio. It was dark outside and rainy, kind of an awful night, but John didn't care. He was way too excited, because that night he and his buddies were on their way to see the megastar musician Prince perform live. Prince was obviously a massive star at the time, and anyone would have been pretty excited to go see him perform live. But this was a particularly big deal for John and his friends, because Prince was actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was just 20 minutes away from St. Paul where they were from. So it was kind of like they were going to see their hometown hero. Now, John and his friends didn't expect to become huge rock star gods like Prince, but there was just something about seeing this hometown guy achieve his dreams on an international scale that was really inspiring. John and his friends were so stoked about this concert, they couldn't wait to get there. John, full of excitement, turned around to talk to his friends in the back seat about how great the concert was going to be. But right as he turned around, he heard a loud screeching sound and whipped his head back just in time to see headlights aimed straight at a tree they were careening toward. He screamed. He heard his friends screaming. They smashed into the tree, and everything went dark. A few minutes later, a St. Paul police officer named Brian Coyle and his patrol partner pulled up behind the now-wrecked Jeep. They'd been on regular patrol when they got a call about the car crash. The call hadn't come from anyone in the crash, so they didn't know what to expect. When Coyle stepped out and walked toward the wreck, it was raining and dark, visibility wasn't great. But right away, he saw three teenagers standing upright outside the car. They looked shaken up and had visible cuts, but overall they seemed okay. While Coyle's partner examined the wreck, Coyle walked up to the teens. Through tears, one of them explained that he had been driving, went too fast, tried to take a sharp turn, hydroplaned, lost control, and hit the tree. Then he said, "It doesn't matter how it happened. My friend John is still in the car, and he's not moving." Officer Coyle left the teenagers and walked over to the wreck, where his partner was. He knelt down and looked inside the Jeep. John was slumped over in the passenger seat, not moving. Coyle asked his partner, "Have you checked him? Is he okay?" His partner looked back and said, "No, he's dead." Coyle took a deep breath. While his partner called for backup and taped off the scene, Coyle went back to John's friends and broke the news as gently as he could. They were devastated. The only thing Coyle could do was call an ambulance to take them to the hospital to get checked out. Once the ambulance had taken them away and John's body had been removed, Officer Coyle and his partner began documenting the scene by taking photos of a wrecked car. Standard procedure. About a week later, when they were reviewing the photos, Coyle noticed something shocking. One of the pictures he'd taken was so bizarre it ended up in newspapers not only in Minnesota, but across the country. Even today, 30-plus years later, people still talk about it. In the photo, above the Jeep's open door, there appears to be a flash of light. But to Officer Coyle and many others, it looks eerily similar to John Bulwer's face, the 16-year-old victim. Some say it looks like the photo captured the moment of John's spirit departing Earth, his final moment in life, screaming as the car crashed into the tree. One evening in the summer of 1974, a 60-year-old doctor named Julian Kerchek sat beside his backyard pool at his home in Old Westbury, New York, a suburb of New York City. It was a quiet, sunny day, and Dr. Kerchek was glad to have some time to relax. He was a surgeon at a local hospital and had a wife and 4 children. Moments of peace were rare. Dr. Kerchek leaned back, closed his eyes, and tried to relax, when suddenly he heard something rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, he figured it must be a squirrel or a bird, so he didn't open his eyes. But the sound persisted. Finally, he got up to see what was going on. The bushes were about 20 feet away, so he walked closer and froze. Someone was standing in the bushes. But this was no normal person. The figure wore a long, dark robe that covered their whole body. The hood obscured their face, a dark, motionless presence standing in the shadows. Dr. Kerchek stood there, frozen. Should he yell? Run? Call for help? Then, the robed figure slowly extended one long, thin arm and beckoned him forward. In that instant, terror washed over him. The figure looked like the Grim Reaper, and it felt like death itself was calling him to come closer. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Over the next few days, Dr. Kerchak couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. It felt like a vision of death, as if the Grim Reaper had come to tell him his time was up. But he was a man of science, a surgeon. He tried to reason with himself. Was it a hallucination? A trick of light? Still, it felt too real, too vivid. He couldn't tell anyone who would believe him. The thought consumed him for months. Then, in October of 1974, Dr. Kerchak suddenly fell ill with a fever that wouldn't go away. When he went to see his doctor, he received devastating news. He had an incurable form of blood cancer. It broke his heart, but deep down, he wasn't surprised. He believed the Grim Reaper had visited him to warn him of his death. Shortly after sharing his story with newspapers, Dr. Kerchak passed away dead on the afternoon of Sunday, August 27, 2000. A 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leininger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and his wife and his 2-year-old son, James, had just gotten home from church, and now Bruce was just trying to relax. However, it was proving very difficult to relax, because as Bruce was trying to sit on the couch and just kind of close his eyes for a second, his son James, the 2-year-old, had his toy plane, his favorite toy plane, and he was repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he could, saying, "Plane crash, plane crash, plane crash." And while of course James was a kid, he was going to be loud and noisy and obnoxious. That's what kids do. For Bruce, watching his son do this was really concerning. Lately, over the past few months, James had become unnaturally fixated, not on planes, but on plane crashes. Even more specifically, James had begun having these recurring nightmares several times a week, where he'd wake up terrified and say he had just been in a horrible, fiery plane crash. It was the same nightmare every night. Bruce and his wife didn't even know what to make of it. Where was he getting this from? James was a pretty sheltered kid. He wasn't being exposed to horrible plane crashes in movies, TV shows, or books. He was only 2 years old. It made no sense. What made it even more unsettling was that James wasn't just fixated on a plane crash aspect. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife strange details about the crash. It was always the same one. He began saying things like, "The Japanese shot me down." Bruce and his wife were stunned. Bruce and his wife were stunned. What is he referencing? Is this a World War II reference? But again, he was 2. Developmentally, that wasn't something he'd even say, even if he'd somehow been exposed to it. It just didn't make sense. Over the past few months, as this behavior ramped up, Bruce and his wife had taken James to the doctor, asking, "What's going on? What's our kid doing? We don't understand this." The doctor said, "He's a kid. It's a weird fixation, but he'll grow out of it." But James wasn't growing out of it. He was getting more and more fixated. So, as Bruce sat there watching James smash his toy plane into the coffee table again, he decided he had to do something. Over the next few months, instead of trying to stop James, Bruce leaned in, asking his son to tell him more about what he was seeing in his nightmare. James eventually said it wasn't just the Japanese, it was the Japanese military. And the plane he was flying in was a Corsair airplane. Bruce had never even heard of that before. Looking at his 2-year-old son, he thought, "How do you even know what a Corsair is?" In November that year, Bruce was sitting in the living room with a World War II coffee table book he'd bought for his father, but hadn't given him yet. He saw James playing with his plane and decided to try something. He opened the book to photos of pilots in combat and called James over. "Do you recognize any of these planes? Is one of them the Corsair you flew in your dream?" James looked at the pictures, but didn't seem to recognize any of them, until he suddenly stopped, pointed at one page, and said, "That's where I was shot down." He was pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Bruce didn't really know what to make of it, but it lined up with what James had been saying, a pilot shot down by the Japanese military during World War II. So Bruce began researching the Battle of Iwo Jima. He discovered that there were no records of any Corsair airplanes crashing during that battle. In fact, no Corsairs were flown there at all. So he figured there must be a hole in James's story. Maybe he'd heard something, misunderstood it, and built a story around it in his 2-year-old mind. Still, Bruce wanted to know if there had been any pilots named James who crashed during the battle. He couldn't find any. Then he reached out to a veterans group of men who had served at Iwo Jima, based in San Diego. Under the pretense of filming a documentary, Bruce attended one of their gatherings and began asking questions. Most of the men told him to speak with the group's historian, who knew the details of what happened during the battle. When Bruce spoke with him, the historian said that during that battle, almost no planes were shot down, except one. A single U.S. pilot was shot down and killed. His name was James Houston Jr. Bruce was shocked. The only pilot shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima was named James, just like his son, who had been talking for months about being shot down by the Japanese military during that same battle. It seemed impossible. Bruce reminded himself that his son had said he was flying a Corsair, and the plane James Houston Jr. flew wasn't a Corsair. That had to be the difference. This was just coincidence. Still shaken, Bruce called his wife, downplayed his fear, and together they decided to do more research. They learned that James Houston Jr. had a sister who was still alive and decided to contact her. When the sister learned that a 2-year-old boy had been talking about her brother's death, she sent Bruce's family several photographs of her brother in uniform and standing beside his planes. When Bruce looked at the photos, his world stopped. In one photo, James Houston Jr. was standing in front of a Corsair airplane, the exact type of plane his son had named. For Bruce, the coincidences were now too many to ignore. This was no longer random. And then there was one more chilling detail. Occasionally, his son would insist, "My name is James III." Now Bruce realized James Houston Jr. was James II. Could his son really be James III, the reincarnation of a World War II pilot? Bruce eventually took his son's story to the media, and it became the subject of a televised segment on ABC. Later, James attended a reunion for the Iwo Jima veterans, where he stunned the group with his detailed knowledge of the battle. When he met James Houston Jr.'s sister, he called her by a nickname only her late brother had ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit had returned to Earth in the body of James III. If reincarnation is real, James's story remains one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history.